Hello! Today I want to talk about Blade & Soul Heroes versus Blade & Soul Neo. Let's get into it. To start us off, a quick overview. Blade & Soul Neo, of course, as many people know from this channel, is the MMORPG everyone here loves to play or loves to hate. It has a slew of problems with it, but the gameplay, the mechanics behind what your character can actually do in PvE, PvP, is largely an experience you can't find other places. In contrast, Blade & Soul Heroes is a MMO gacha game. Think Wuthering Waves, think Genshin Impact. There is still MMO elements involved. You can still do dungeon runs and things similar to other MMO games with friends or solo. However, there isn't going to be the same emphasis on the combat systems and stuff, and much more emphasis on making sure the game looks and feels fun to play on a mobile or a PC device. Beyond that, this is of course a gacha game. Blade & Soul Heroes' main goal is to make you spend as much money as possible on passes, on battle gear and characters and everything else in between. They want you to roll, 11 copies of the same character in order to get a maxed out character, and that can run you $1,000. And that's just for one person. Granted, of course, you can spend $1,000 pretty easily in Neo too if you're whale enough, but that's on other things. Next, we have the actual polish of the systems itself. Blade & Soul Neo is heavily antiquated, barring a lot of the systems, a lot of the networking issues that you felt back in Live, and just porting them over to a new skin of the game, with skill books and everything included that a lot of people aren't super happy about. Now, Blade & Soul Heroes, on the other hand, has a much more polished system. You can tell this game was built from the ground up for a very different user experience. There is a lot of polish that actually goes into the game, and outside of a few wonky, janky things with combat where you're trying to move and have it attack at the same time, there's a lot of ease of maneuverability throughout the UI and a lot of guiding hands helping you with all the fucking notifications everywhere. Now, granted, there is still a ton of crazy systems involved in Heroes as well as Neo. They're both equally hard to understand, but the game holds your hand a lot more in Heroes, whereas in Neo, I'm sure people would actually appreciate a bit more hand-holding because there's way too much to experience, especially as a new player, but that just kind of throws you the way and says, yeah, figure it out. Next up, the gameplay. In Neo, you have a very good combat system. However, you are grinding everything that you need to do all the time, and you're splitting those hours in. In Blade & Soul Heroes, because it's taking from a lot of other games from the gacha sphere, you do have a lot of just auto gameplay built into it. You can literally click on a mission and your character will basically run the mission for you, unless it's a mission that you're supposed to investigate or find out yourself. If it's something as easy as just go find these enemies on the map and kill them, the game will literally take care of that for you as long as your characters are strong enough to actually fight the things. On top of that, you have these integrated systems to allow you to do auto battles and real-time battles at the same time, and you can basically just auto both of them. And there's just this whole different aspect to the game where a lot of the grinding is meant to be a lot easier on the player, especially because players are meant to be doing this on their phone half the time. As a mobile game, there's a lot of emphasis on this kind of just auto simulator where you're just meant to leave the device open for however many hours and kind of let the game play itself or be like a side thing while you're doing your work or doing other business. Whereas the actual MMORPG aspect of Blade & Soul Neo keeps it from doing that, because instead of being able to just click on a dungeon and say, oh, auto run this, I've beat this before, you do have to actually put in the experience to run the dungeons because it's meant to be much more of a collaborative effort. Now, that isn't to say that there isn't collaborative effort in Heroes as well. There are dungeon runs that you can do and they give very good rewards, and those cannot be autoed in the same way. You still have auto procs on your abilities and things like that. Even though you can do it manual, it's really not worth it. However, beyond just that and maybe some PvP interactions, there's not a ton that you actually have to really focus on in the game outside of maybe a boss battle or two that you're not super geared up for. Now, one thing I want to add as an addendum to all of this is that Blade & Soul Heroes is competing against the giants of Wuthering Waves, Genshin Impact, and other similar ones that honestly do these same systems or similar systems and just kind of do them better. A lot of people find that the gameplay in Heroes, while fluid enough, just isn't the same as you would expect from something in the genre. It does stuff differently for sure, but whether or not that different stuff is appealing to the players, I can't really say, but it doesn't seem to be all that amazing to really bring in crowds of people. Compare that to Blade and Soul Neo, where Neo had an entire emergence because Blade and Soul Live had died, and there were hordes of people interested in playing the live experience again based off of its unique gameplay in the MMO sphere. Blade and Soul Neo has the unique aspect of having a really, really good combat system where you can just feel like the absolute epitome of, Sung Jinwoo in solo leveling, beating the shit out of stuff and looking like a badass doing it, like so many KR MMOs are kind of known for, but this one does it in a much better way. Now, that isn't to say that Neo gameplay is absolutely peak. There's a ton of issues that the game has itself, but at least the combat system isn't one of them. It's actually the biggest draw to the game that brings so many people to play it, despite everything else wrong with it. Next up, we have the reward structures of the game. Now, Neo is known classically for just being way too late in so many aspects, at least for its global release. There are a ton of events going on in many different regions, and unfortunately the events aren't actually synced between regions. Taiwan has different events than Japan, has different events than EU and ANA does, which have different events than Korea did. Now, some of them are shared, but the experience is not the same across the board, and nor is it the most amazing experience either way, at least for the NAE releases. There has been a large lack of rewards given to players and a large outcry from players saying we need more than this. And unfortunately, half the time it feels like it falls on deaf ears. Now, the game did do a very good job with the latest releases in Silver Frost, giving players a lot of what they had been asking for, but the question is, was it too little too late? To be explored in another video. However, with Blade and Soul Heroes, this seems to be the opposite. Heroes is kicking off with a huge influx of just rewards and gems and every good thing that you would want from a gacha game being thrown at you in order to try to entice players to play the game more, in order to entice players to get that experience. Now, granted, this might be because you kind of need to play the game for several hours in order to actually get to a point where you're playing the game. The first 9 or 12 chapters from this game itself are basically tutorial, teaching you how to work with the different systems, where to pull, how to increase your character combat, how to actually go through these different combat modes, because there's 5, 6, 7 of them. I can't even keep count, nor do I care. And beyond all of that, if you're someone new to a gacha experience, you're going to have to kind of learn how those games play to begin with. Now, granted, I'm sure a lot of people playing Heroes are already gacha players themselves, and they're familiar with a lot of these systems, so it's not going to be too alienating, but that is something to keep in mind. But like I said, given all of that, there is a ton of rewards being given out. For God's sakes, they gave out 10,000 gems to players just for logging into the game based off of a downloads rewards that they had. And that, in terms of in-game purchases, is equal to $150 worth of stuff. Neo could never. We wish we had that. We wish we had $10 worth of stuff given to us half the time. But all this is basically to say that there seems to be a large investment in Blade and Soul Heroes. NCSoft really wants to see this do well and is really, really trying to entice players to keep playing this game. I can't really say the same for Neo, however. Neo definitely is trying to keep its players, but it's definitely not putting in that same kind of effort we see with Heroes, and I think we all know why. And of course, this difference that we're talking about is demographic and return on investment. The demographic for Blade and Soul Heroes is a much wider audience and offers a lot more return on investment possible than Blade and Soul Neo ever had a chance of achieving. Neo is a game built from a game that was popular 5 to 10 years ago that basically just tried to get the population of players that existed at the time as teenagers or college students and are now working adults, a lot of them with kids and families and other kind of responsibilities, to play a game that really requires a lot of time investment to begin with, and a lot of people don't have that time. Now, a lot of people will swipe because they don't have that time in order to try to keep their character progression going, but a lot of people won't. And that's also where we see a whole lot of fall off in the Neo sphere. A lot of people wanted to scratch that itch with Neo for a little bit of time, but have since fallen off. And we see that steady decline in the numbers throughout its history and still going. Whereas Heroes, I'm sure day 1 had a lot more interest than days 2 and 3, as is such for any kind of new game. But Heroes is made for a demographic of, let's be honest, children. This is a game slated for teenagers, tweens, And anywhere kind of 5 to 10 years beyond that, of course, you can play it at any age and enjoy it. It is a gacha game and it is fun to look at and kind of experience overall, but it is meant to appeal to a specific demographic of very vulnerable players. And these players might or might not have access to their mommy and daddy's credit card and really want the new characters more so than their friends have, and want to swipe to get those new characters with the permission or not of their parents. Now, this is not to throw flame at anyone who is swiping and is not of that age, or make any assumptions anywhere else, but it is more just to make a critique on what the gacha gaming sphere is in general. Gacha gaming is known to be very predatory and is actually banned in Europe across many different places for this particular reason. Because of this, you actually see the game not even available to play in EU, and anyone who wants to play from EU has to use a VPN or something else to spoof their location, so that way they can play on the NA global servers. Now, of course, there's also the fact that this game is made to be played on a phone. Blade & Soul Heroes being able to be played mobilely is a huge boon for it because, of course, everyone has a phone, but of course, not many people have PCs that can really run these kinds of MMO games like you see in Neo, or basically any other game for that matter. Try playing most games on a fucking MacBook. Good luck. But everyone has a phone. Almost everyone has a phone, I should say. And the fact that you have all these people willing to play mobile games where they won't invest in a PC to play a lot of other big hardcore PC games is the reason why mobile games do so well. In fact, you look at the Blade & Soul franchise as well as any other franchise made from NCSoft, and you look at the revenue numbers over the last year or two, and any game that had a mobile version that did, even remotely well, did extraordinarily well compared to its PC counterpart. And this is what drove a lot of people to actually play in those spheres with those IPs because they were brought in from the mobile game. Now that might be something that NCSoft is going at here too, and it might also be the reason why Heroes is a prequel to Blade & Soul Neo. It might be trying to drive attention to the franchise through a much more easily introducible and easily digestible version of itself in terms of the prequel story and in terms of just the gameplay in general. Once people get used to Blade & Soul as a franchise, I'm sure there will be more interest in making either Neo better or a new version of Blade & Soul to really capture the attention of those players as they grow older or maybe get the gear to spend more on PC rigs and that kind of stuff. However, it is no secret that, of course, Blade & Soul Heroes is slated to just do wildly better than any other Blade & Soul game ever has because of the fact that it is a mobile game and it is a gacha game, so it is going to be widely available to way more people who are way more invested in spending small microtransactional amounts on this game until it equals thousands of dollars over the course of a year or two, versus trying to do all of that in an MMO where you're trying to grind for several hours a day just to do all this stuff anyways. Now, just to wheel it back a bit, I did mention that Blade & Soul Heroes is a prequel to Blade & Soul Neo. So for anyone who is interested in the storyline of Blade & Soul, maybe you've played Neo or you played live and you did enjoy where that story went, or you wanted to hear more from the characters from that world, well, Heroes is the perfect opportunity to do so. There's a ton of kind of world expansion and story progression that happens with many different characters, some who you are meeting again, and some who you're meeting for the first time through many different interactive modes, whether that be playing through the game in like a story mission, or experiencing just some cutscenes here and there that play out a story, or experiencing it in the form of a webcomic. Heroes has all of this and more in order to deliver the stories of these characters and really flesh out many nuanced relationships between a lot of them, and I think it actually does a pretty good job. There are a lot of things that I've seen already in my limited time playing that I thought, wow, that was really cool, just as a little mini story, it tied into this whole bigger world. And I do think for the people who really enjoy the characters in the world of Blade & Soul, you absolutely do want to play Heroes. It's going to have a lot of stuff that you are going to really like. Now, of course, Heroes has the one big problem that I already kind of touched on before, in that because it is a gacha game, it's actually banned in many places around the world, specifically in Europe, or at least most of Europe. A lot of places where Blade & Soul Heroes isn't available is because it's not available due to laws preventing it from being accessible to the general public because they're considered predatory. Gacha games are known for this, and there were laws passed recently, I think this year and a little bit of last year, to prevent these games from even existing in half of these places. And so if you do end up in the position where you're trying to play Heroes, but you can't find it on the App Store, it's probably banned where you are, and you have to go through all these different ways to try and access it yourself. Now, whether or not you agree with laws preventing gacha games from being a thing in these countries is a whole different topic that I'm not going to touch on. However, it does make it so that Heroes is a lot harder to access for a lot of the world. Whereas, of course, Blade & Soul Neo is easier to access. There are still places where Neo is not available, and they're working to expand that. There was an expansion, I think a couple months ago, to bring it to a whole lot of countries that didn't have it before. However, that is something to keep in mind. Blade & Soul Neo is a lot more restricted in terms of player base, just based off of who has interest in it, whereas Heroes is a lot more restricted in player base based off of who's allowed to actually gamble online in a gacha game. And of course, the other thing to talk about when talking about these two games together side by side is the community engagement and the information available for them in the public sphere. Blade & Soul Neo, when it was new, did have a lot of interest and did have a lot of people coming back and making YouTube videos and all these things. People started making guides for their classes and all that kind of stuff, and every bit of that is basically gone now. Try looking up Blade & Soul Neo on YouTube and you're not going to find anything. Or try looking up Blade & Soul Neo, just the channel in general, and you're still not going to find anything. There's nothing on it. The Blade & Soul YouTube page publishes like a video every month or two to basically hype up their new release. There's no information available to help you with the game whatsoever. Compare that to Blade & Soul Heroes now, that has all that basic new game like interest, all the people giving their ratings and reviews, like this video. And then also all the people talking about the characters that are good or bad and their new builds and their experience with the story and blah blah blah. There's a whole lot more community-driven interest in Heroes because it is a new game, but also because of the kind of game that it is. And whether or not that will fall off will largely depend on the success of it. But for now, there is a lot more going on, and if you're trying to look up the game, you can find all this information that you want to know a lot more readily. On top of that, there's also just a lot more engagement from NCSoft. Blade & Soul Heroes has its own YouTube page. When you go on that YouTube page, there's a lot of hype stuff for all the new characters and things coming out and for the game itself, but there's also like actual video tutorials giving you step-by-step video instruction of how to work through half of the stuff in this game and all the different systems and things. So that way, if you're a player and you're trying to find this stuff, you can find it pretty easily. Guess what a lot of people have problems with in Neo? All of that shit. If someone in Neo is not making a guide for it will never exist. And this applies to systems, this applies to builds and classes, this applies to just general wealth and information, everything. At least Heroes seems to have that kind of motivated interest in it right now. And like I said before, the company itself is trying to hype up Heroes much more than Neo, so you have much more support to help the general player base who's trying to get into this game, especially since it's a new kind of game for NCSoft to really do, at least in the Blade & Soul space. So with all of this being said, what's the point of this video? Well, basically I just wanted to compare the two games and kind of give my opinions on both of them together, since I think they could be a package deal, but kind of not. I think Blade & Soul Neo, of course, I always have a soft spot for, but there's a lot of more investment from the company going into Blade & Soul Heroes, and it seems like the future of the franchise is in Heroes much more than it is in Neo. I don't particularly think Heroes is a great game, but I don't think it's a bad game either. I think it's a fun gacha game to kind of play, especially if you enjoy the world of Blade & Soul, and you just kind of get to let it go. You just get to have it do its own thing, do some auto plays, maybe do a dungeon run or two. You can be more or less invested in it, and it really doesn't matter too much. It is a gacha game in the end of the day, and as long as you're having fun playing whatever game you're playing, that's what counts. But of course, I will always prefer the much higher octane combat systems and gameplay of Neo versus Blade & Soul Heroes. In fact, I wish there were a bit more mechanics from Neo that made its way into Blade & Soul Heroes. However, I'm sure a lot of that was changed because of the fact that it had to be available on mobile platform as well, versus just being on PC. I do hope Heroes drums up more interest in the franchise in general, and I do hope people do experiment with Neo, maybe after or while playing Heroes. I'm sure a lot of people playing Neo are already going towards Heroes just to see what it's like, or to see what it's about, even though there's no real crossover between the two games outside of the one NCA versus stream that gave everyone codes for some in-game stuff just to look at Heroes and see what it's about. But yeah, I do think Heroes is a much more polished game. I do think It is a game that you can try and you can very easily pick up or put down. And I would say, if you're a fan of gachas, or you feel like trying it, or you feel like seeing what the gameplay and the story is like, it could be a fun time for you. Do I think it's an absolute must play? No. And do I think Nioh is an absolute must play? No. Neither of them are absolutely series defining games, you know, game of the year kind of content, but they are both fun in their own ways. And I hope that more than anything, instead of comparing the two, people can take them side by side as not necessarily a package deal, but as complements to each other, where one gives you much more high octane gameplay and experiences in an MMO environment. The other can give you a lot more lighthearted fun and storytelling, and also just, you know, something more for your casual downtime versus a really dedicated grind. So whether or not Hero or Nioh was your first experience to the Blade & Soul universe, I hope you can kind of enjoy yourself in the world that it is, and enjoy the experiences that you have through either game, interact with the communities. There are a lot of fun people there. And with all that said, I'll catch you next time.